So, chapter 2, friends, how many of you are old enough to have remembered or grew up watching Ron Howard as Opie on TV? Just put it in the chat box over there. That chat box is where you can put questions and comments, and I love it when you do that. So, you remember that? I grew up with Opie on TV. Ron Howard was just so adorable. And he grew up to really become an incredible director. I start off the chapter 2 with a little anecdote from him. You know, he talks about how incredibly wonderful it was to grow up, to be a kid on the set. And he says that, on the set, he was treated as an equal, even as a kid. And that the crew and the directors and everything about that environment was really positive for him. And one of the things that he really learned that he takes into his directing today is how important it is to have that symbiotic relationship among the team, where everybody is valued, where everybody knows their roles, everybody's contributing, down to the most seemingly insignificant role. And so in the beginning of chapter 2, I start with a little anecdote that he said, and that is when asked what he likes about being a director, he says the director gets to play with everybody. So this whole idea of teamwork is so important. I wrote this book, did this research about thinking like a filmmaker because I really began to ask myself, who are some of the most provocative storytellers of our day? And filmmakers were at the top of my list. And I began to study filmmaking. I began to talk to filmmakers and find out if there were things that I could learn from their process, from their techniques about telling stories that, some good movies are unforgettable for us, right? I mean, they really stick with us. And years later, we may remember something from a film. So I want to be sure that worship is that way as well, because the messages that we offer hopefully will stick with people long after the worship is over. So I began to ask myself, how is it that good filmmakers make things unforgettable? And so one of the things that I learned that I focus on in chapter 2 is the absolute necessity of teamwork to bring sensory-rich communication alive. And that's what filmmakers do, sensory-rich communication. We're not just going to a movie theater and sitting there and watching a talking head talk about something for a little while, and then maybe we watch some scenery, and then maybe we sit in darkness and listen to some music. That's just not how they do it. They do something called layering, and this is a technique that I've been teaching for many years, where we take all of those art forms out of their separate sandboxes, we put them in the same sandbox to play together, and we think whenever we're discerning how will we bring this, let's say, scripture alive today, we may think immediately, well, perhaps we need a song to bookend it, and maybe we keep the music playing underneath it. And what we'll talk about when we get to the music chapter is how that really focuses us and helps us hear the words better. But at any rate, all of that takes teamwork, right? Because now we're talking about not just slotting things in and having the individual worship artists do their work on their own. We're talking about collaboration. And so that gets into teamwork right away. And what Ron Howard says is that there's no way you can do it without a team. Maybe you can make a student film with one camera and one director, and maybe the same director goes and acts in front of it. But that's about as high as you can take it in terms of quality. If you really want to begin to bring in all the art forms, then we need collaboration and we need help. Now, I know from working with churches, large and small, and being a member of very small churches most of my life, I know that it can be challenging to get people to help. And even more today, it's challenging because people are so reticent, because they're so busy, to commit to, say, a year-long worship committee. And so I began years ago to say, okay, how can we blow up the stereotype of what a worship committee looks like or what a worship committee does? And so that's a little bit of what I share in chapter 2 is what are the roles and how can we plug people in at their level of passion that meets our level of need, and then gets more people involved in the whole project. So in the book, I just want to mention that if you haven't read the book yet or you haven't gotten it yet, the case study movie that I use throughout the book is this fabulous little film called Under the Tuscan Sun. And it takes place in Tuscany. And they filmed it there. And one of the things that the director, Audrey Wells, talks about is that she wanted local people to be in the film. She didn't want to just, bus in a bunch of, stand-ins and actors for everything. She wanted to use the local people as much as possible. So any of the scenes in the piazza, in the restaurants, these are actually people who live in this little town where they filmed. There's a scene in a movie theater, and there's a little movie theater there in the town, and everybody in those seats, except for the main actors, are people from the town, which I think is so cool because, eventually they're going to watch themselves on that screen when the movie came out. The food in some of the scenes where Frances is making dinner for the people who are helping her refurbish the house, that's all made by the local restaurant. So Audrey Wells, the director, wanted to get as many local people involved. And here's the thing that happened with that, and that is that not only did the local people get more invested in the success of the film, and not just interested from afar, they got interested because they were involved. And the crew and actors that were guests that came in from out of town became more invested in the film and the place because they got to interact with the people. And this is sort of a metaphor for me for the symbiotic relationship that we want between leaders and congregation. Liturgy literally means the work of the people. So let's put the people to work, I say. Now, some people are just going to be in worship and they're going to be participating in worship. That's going to be their contribution. When people are not participating, when the congregation are simply observers, that's when it becomes entertainment, right? That's sort of the line is congregation must be involved for it to be worship. That is the very definition of liturgy, the work of the people. But we can also get people more involved in worship by having them help us design it. And so that's, really been something I've dedicated my work to. And that is, how do we get people involved? How do we get them invested more in the outcome? Because the more people you have involved and helping even with one tiny little aspect, the more you will have people's appreciation for what it takes to put worship together go up. They'll know more about worship, and therefore their investment in the worship of the church will be higher. Their anticipation will be higher. Their appreciation will be higher. So, Ron Howard goes on to say that most human endeavors depend on a methodical consideration of all the possibilities and then preparation and execution. And he goes on to talk about how that manifests itself in filmmaking. But here, listen to those words, a methodical consideration of all the possibilities, and then preparation and execution. What I love about his viewpoint is that absolutely there's creativity, but we have to have a methodical process. He goes on to say that when you have these things, when you have that methodical process and everybody knows what's expected, then you build trust. And I think you build trust not just with the people who are helping you out, but you also build trust in the congregation because what they get to experience, they see the involvement of people. And so building trust is really, really important, especially if you want to begin to push the edges and not just do same old every week. If you want to get out of a rut, you want to be able to build the trust that will help people know that just because it's different for this series doesn't mean I'm losing, that which feels familiar forever. We always want to be mindful of that. So building trust is huge. And I love that Ron Howard talks about what builds trust the fastest, and that's a methodical process. Now, a lot of us went to seminary. We had worship courses. We had probably one semester of worship. And what I have found in guest teaching at many, many seminaries, I think I'm up to maybe 15 or 16 different seminaries that I've guest taught at. What I know about seminary is that you got to get the basics in. you got to get the what and the why in, and sometimes that leaves not enough time for the how. And I think this is why when I finished my PhD, I really felt called to continue to teach outside of the seminary, because when you get out of seminary, then you go, oh my gosh, Sunday comes around every week and I have to put something together. And so you realize the questions that you maybe should have asked in seminary, because you're out there doing it and you realize, okay, I need a little bit more guidance. So that's why I've dedicated my ministry to teaching these processes, these creative processes, team processes. So team roles. The next thing I do in the chapter is that I start to talk about team member roles. And there's several aspects to this. One is that, as I alluded to before, it's hard to get people to commit to a year-long commitment anymore. People are busy. Some times of the year are just super crazy for folks. We're busier than ever in our lives because we have there's more possibilities of things to do and things to be engaged in. It's just the way that our world is now, because we're exposed to so many things. So one of the things that I have come up with is a different tiers of involvement, different levels of involvement. The first one is called the core team. And the core team are people who are working on worship all the time. That's pastors, that's music directors if you have one, even if it's a part-time music director. It's people who want to work on worship all the time. Those people who would say yes to a year-long worship team. So that's the core team, and they are working throughout the year on every series. Now, when I say series, for those of you who may not have been with me last month, I'm talking about perhaps a liturgical season, if you follow the liturgical year, or a month-long series. It's a period of time where you're going to be on a spiritual journey over a few weeks that has a main overarching theme, and then you get to go deeper into that theme every week. So there's a second tier of involvement called a series team member, and those would be people who perhaps could volunteer just for that series. There's a lot of really great advantages to having people come in just for a series. It's an extra boost of energy for the core team because we've got some, fresh meat, some fresh energy. And because the core team is going to be simultaneously working on the details of one series while they sort of brainstorm for the series after that. If you have a couple of people even who are just on one series, then they can really focus on helping perhaps carry out the tasks to get ready for that series, because they're not having to think about any other series at all. So there's series team members. So let's say you're a fairly small church and you have two core members. Maybe it's the pastor and a part-time music director. If you just added maybe 2 or 3 other people to your team just for a series, you would have 4 or 5 people working on a specific series. And that's a really good number, actually. A great number for getting things done, a great number for coming up with fresh ideas. Now, the third tier of involvement is what I call an extended team member. These are people who would never have the time to actually volunteer for even a series, but they may be really super creative people. Let's say you have somebody who's really creative. They're in all kinds of projects in their lives, so there's no way they can be on the worship team. But what if you just invite them to come to the brainstorming party for the next series? They just come to the party. It's a one-night commitment. They bring all of their creativity. They're not anxious about things because this is the extent to which they're involved, right? And they just bring their energy and their creativity just to that one night. That's a great, great contribution. Okay, let's say that you have somebody who loves music, but doesn't have time to be on the worship team, even for a series. Let's say that you just ask them to, let's say your church has a contemporary service. Let's say it's a service that uses a lot of contemporary music. And maybe this person listens to contemporary radio all the time. You show them the song select site, and you ask them just search these keywords for songs that would have to do with, let's say we're going to do a series on light. Just make me a list of your favorite songs from the radio about light, and so that maybe is their one contribution that they make. Or Conversely, if it's somebody, a choir member that just can go through the hymnal, look in the index, look at all the songs about light and make you a list. They're not plugging them in. There's no decisions to be made. You just give them some keywords and have them make you a list. This is going to be so great when you start putting scripts together, when you start actually putting the orders of worship together, because you don't have to do that. Somebody's already made you a list and you go, oh my gosh, that one would be perfect. Oh yeah, that would be perfect for week 2. Wow, let's do that one for week 3, right? So they've given you a boost up. They've saved you some time. And they got to be part of the process in a very limited way, but in a way that they could, that met their passion. All right, let's say we're coming up on Christmas and you need a manger built and you've got a carpenter in your sanctuary, in your congregation. Just give them that task. They can be part of the worship team as well. So here's what I'm trying to say is that we need to blow up the stereotypes of what a worship team is and find out how we can have a team of people that we can draw from to give them specific tasks that doesn't overextend them, that doesn't involve them in a way that stresses them out, but involves them in a way that's really fun for them. And we're doing it far enough ahead, that it is not a stressful thing. You're not calling them up and saying, I need a list of songs by tomorrow. Let me say that again. You're not calling up and saying, I need a list of songs by tomorrow, right? Then the next time you call, they see it come up on the caller ID and they go, oh no, I'm not answering that one, right? So this is faithful stewardship of our resources, is getting into a methodical procedure, a methodical process that helps us do this far enough ahead of time that people actually love helping you out. Okay, so those 3 tiers. Now, in the book, what I do next is I sort of draw some analogies between the team member roles on a filmmaking team and the way that we can think about putting a series together and the kind of talents we might need. Visual, lighting, media, music, that kind of thing. So I draw some analogies there. I'll let you read that on your own. But then the next thing that I sort of come across is this need for a methodical process, because we need to have in place ways for people to communicate, right? And for there to not be too many cooks in the kitchen. So pastors, you are what I call visionaries, right? The director of a film is the visionary of that film. The director has their finger on the pulse. They know the bigger vision. So when it comes to directing various people on the team, we really need that. Worship team is not a democratic process, my friends. It has to have a visionary. Now, we want to invite all ideas. All ideas are welcome, but there's going to be a point at which the director, the visionary, i.e. preacher, and perhaps a couple of other people are going to sit down and actually put the orders of worship together. And that's when some things fall on the cutting room floor. All right, so we need to know that up front, which we're going to get to. The final thing that I do in this chapter is I talk about a team covenant so that everybody knows what the deal is and can know what to expect and don't get their feelings hurt. So I give an example about establishing communication in sensory-rich worship because this example of a series called Watch and Pray. And let's say that we're going to be lighting candles at various sort of altar stations, tables around the room. And so if you think about it, even though that's going to be something that repeats every week, in order to create that for the first Sunday in the series, we're going to have maybe you're involving the property manager who knows where the tables are, who are going to set up tables. We have to have that message to that person about where to set those up. Then we're going to have some visual artists perhaps who have gotten some different hues of fabric that we've decided on is our color palette, and they're going to need to dress that. They're going to need to set up the candles. So maybe you involve somebody who was making a trip to IKEA, but maybe was in the next town because IKEA has really cheap candles, or the grocery store that has the devotional candles. So maybe you involve somebody in getting those. Then you've got to set that up. Then the musicians are going to be deciding what's the feel of the time when we go and we light candles. And they're going to be choosing music that perhaps is contemplative for that time. Then the verbal artists are going to be figuring out how do we introduce that time and how do we wrap it up. So you see already we have several different people involved in that one ritual action. Now here's the good thing and a really important thing, and that is in series I talk about having threads. And threads are those things that repeat every week. It starts to feel familiar to folks. It also helps you not get burned out, the team not get burnt out. Because if you were doing that kind of coordination every week for something different, a one-hit wonder every week, you can't sustain it, right? So we don't want to burn out our volunteers, so we're going to make sure that that's something perhaps that we repeat every Sunday. Maybe the music is different. Maybe the way we get people into it, the verbiage that we use, maybe getting out of it. We use a different poem or prayer at the end of that time, but essentially the ritual action is the same. Now, so let's just think about the people who may have contributed. Maybe that choir member that sat down and came up with all songs about light, that person has contributed because now you have a whole list of songs you can choose from for that ritual action every week. Perhaps we had that HGTV addict who never thought that they could be a liturgical artist. Maybe they watched the webinar with me or read the chapter in the book about the different design things you want to think about, having the candles at different levels and draping the fabric and that kind of thing on these side altars. So you've gotten them involved, perhaps. Maybe you had somebody who loves poetry, searching for poetry for you, for a short poem about light or about waiting and watching. If this is our Advent series, let's say, that's called Watch and Pray, maybe they collected some poems for you. And that's what you're going to do at the end of the candle lighting time or at the beginning. So see how you've gotten people involved at their level of passion with a specific task, and they get to see the fruit of their labor every single week. All right, so I hope this is becoming clear that we're trying to sort of adjust our thinking about how we include people. So in the chapter then, and I'm going to wrap up here, I go through what I call a production timeline. And I don't want you to be afraid of this word production. Production actually just means a methodical process by which to put things together so that people know what is the timeline, what are we going to do, where am I involved, where am I not involved, and when are my due dates, right? And so I go through the whole production timeline. And you'll, as you read the book, you'll sort of see what this is all about. But quickly, it starts with naming the direction. That's a visionary role, right? And that's less people involved because it involves decisions. Because my number one rule is when there's decisions to be made, there's less people involved. When there are no decisions to be made, there are more people involved. So naming the direction, i.e. making a theme, deciding what that is. The brainstorming party, that's all hands on deck. All right, we want as many ideas as possible. And this is going to kick off the whole thing. And I give you a very detailed description of the way that you could put a brainstorming party together. They're loads of fun. And then past that brainstorming, you have resource gathering. And in my timeline, I suggest that you give about a month to have people make lists of songs for you, have people search for images for the projections, have people think about what's the visual installation going to be. Have people choosing what the anthems are going to be and start rehearsing those. So resource gathering, that's all hands on deck because no decisions are being made. You're just having ideas. Now things like anthems, those decisions are going to be made a little bit earlier because you want to have time for the choir to practice that. So that's going to be something that perhaps is one of those things that just you and the music director put your heads together about a little bit earlier than some of the other decisions. And then production week is when you sit down and all in one fell swoop, you put all of the scripts together. Now, I'll get more into that detail in chapter 8. I go step by step about how do you create scripts because you're literally going to get them all done at the same time, which means that then you know what tasks need to be carried out. And that's when you need all hands on deck again. Script writing phase, that's just a couple of people, right? That's the cutting room floor. But then when you know what the tasks are, you know how many readers you need, you know we need to go to Home Depot for thus and such, etc. Then you want to farm out those tasks so that more people can be involved, and so that you get to do what you need to do, which you only can do, pastors. That is, write your sermon. Nobody can do that for you. Okay, so the team covenant, last thing, and then we're going to open it up for questions. The team covenant in the back, I have worked with enough worship teams and enough churches to know that, people have personalities. Is that an understatement? We all have personalities and we all have different ways of working. So we have to sort of have an agreement that we have this methodical process in place. We have a production timeline. We're going to be as accountable to that timeline as possible. Not just because we have to, but because it helps every other part of the team do their work more easily. And we have to know that we're going to come up with more ideas than we can use, because that's the gift of having a team that's offering ideas, is that we will end up with more ideas, which is a way better place to start than looking at a blank piece of paper and going, oh Lord, what am I going to do for Advent again this year? Because Christmas comes around every year. It's a way better place to start with more ideas than you can use than scrambling at the last minute for ideas. But we have to establish that that's going to happen, and that indeed your idea that didn't ultimately get used was actually a spark for another idea that did get used. Or we're going to collect those ideas. We have our brainstorming list of ideas that we had, and maybe that idea is going to spark something for another series. Knowing that just coming up with ideas is the gift, right? Not whether or not those ideas actually got used. So anyway, I put together a team covenant based on my work with several teams, although I have to say that the teams that were having the most problems were the most helpful to me, because that gave me a clue as to what kind of agreements and what kind of things we need to talk about up front that helps everybody be on the same page. Okay, that's chapter 2. So I want to open it up. If we can, just put in the chat box. It doesn't have to be a question. It can just be an experience of utilizing volunteers. It can be a story. It can be a question. It can be a reaction to something that I've said, an affirmation just to underscore and say, this is what I heard that I feel like is really important that might help me. So just think about what you might want to feed back to me. And we'll start with one that came in actually by email this week. What are some ways to create sacred space with very small amounts of treasure and talent? You know what? If I had a dime for every time somebody asked me that question, because a lot of people who are part of the worship design studio, and I love this because I came from a small church. I grew up in a small church. I've been a member of small churches almost my entire life. Only a couple times in my life have I been a member of very large churches. But this is the reality, is that sometimes people think, oh, we're a small church. We don't have a budget. I don't have very many people. So some of the things I've already said hopefully will give you some ideas about how to involve people, even if they don't think they have talent per se. So this question specifically around sacred space. If you're going to do, let's stay on this example of a series that focuses on light. So let's say we want to have lots of candles around, but let's say we don't have a big budget. I'll bet that those, even if you're in a church of, let's say 30 people that come on Sunday morning, I'll bet you could get 30 candles. I'll bet everybody has at least one candle at home. And actually, if they brought one candle and we had 30 candles to light every week, and they happened to be the ones that came from people's homes, how special is that, right? And maybe you invite people the first week to light the candle they brought from home. And of course, you always want to have extra candles in case somebody's there who didn't bring a candle, right? And you may want to even gather these before the series begins. Maybe you ask people to light their own candle. Maybe you ask them specifically to light somebody else's candle. And so you just have to think about how can we resource metaphorage, right? I always talk about metaphoraging when we come up with an anchor image for a series, i.e. in this example, candles. How can we draw from what people already have if we don't have a budget? Also, if there's something that I really want for a series, like let's say it's a series based on holy vessels, all right, that's one of the series we have in the Worship Design Studio. And let's say I want a really nice piece of pottery, maybe a couple pieces of pottery, or maybe three, because Worship Design Studio guest expert Todd Pick always says use odd numbers. So let's say we want three. We want a larger one, a middle one, and a smaller one. And I want to have that as part of my visual setting because it's going to give us a visual of that sense of holy vessels. One of the things that I will do is I will get those pieces of pottery. If people don't have them in their homes, I'll invest in them and then let people know that those are for sale at the end of the series. I have never been left with stuff because people get attached to the things, they have spiritual meaning for them, and then they end up buying those individual pieces, right? And then I don't have to store them. They have something that's meaningful, and we've recycled that budget. So that's another way to do that. My friend Howard Hanger in North Carolina, Asheville, North Carolina, one of the things that they do, they don't have a flower budget, and they just have empty vases on their center table. They worship in the round, empty vases, and people bring flowers every week from their garden. They've just established this sort of ritual, this sort of, they've been doing it long enough that they know somebody's always going to bring flowers. And they do, and they show up, and how wonderful to sort of see what flowers show up. That's very cool. Okay, Kay says, visuals coordinator realizing after covenanting with series team that she overcommitted to ideas for each worship service in a series. How to offer care and support for this coordinator. Situation could occur with any one of the team coordinators. Yeah, when we bite off more than we can chew. Overcommitted to ideas. So as we learn by doing, in terms of when we up the sensory rich quotient, at first we might get so excited that we tend to overdo things. We have to remember that simplicity is good, and that especially when it comes to visuals, you really don't want to be doing too much different every week within a series. You may tweak things a little bit along the way. You may have some different things you need to add on a Sunday. For instance, my Lent series last year called Gifts of the Dark Wood, there was a different ritual action every week that we suggested. The first week was a bowl of water with some dissolving paper. The next week was some rocks, and so there was something to be done every week. And so one of the things that I want to suggest that you think about is, and I talk about in terms of the production timeline, and that is if you have some things changing every week, try to get that all amassed, put together in piles before the series begins. So that you, again, this whole production timeline, what we're doing is we're taking what we would normally do in 1 week, the whole creative process from beginning to end. That's what happens in one hit wonders, is that week after week we're trying to do this creative process and it burns us out. So what we're trying to do when we do a series production timeline is we're trying to take what creativity experts have taught us about being more efficient with our time. When we concentrate our efforts in chunks of time and we immerse ourselves in getting a lot done around one thing, we are actually more efficient, because if we drib and drab it out over the series, then we have to gear up and schedule so many different times to get our mind back into that and switch gears from something else. So my suggestion to you is, when you do have various things to put together, number one, make sure you're not overdoing it. Sensory overload. There is such a thing as sensory overload, right? We don't always have to have something new and different every Sunday. But then also immerse yourself in a time of saying, here's the list of things I need for the entire series. If I can't get all of this stuff together myself, it means I need help. So who can help me? Let's get all of these things. Get it all ready for the series all at one time. And then each week it's going to be easier to make that happen. I hope that makes sense. All right. John says, is there a way to have the same team work on both traditional worship and contemporary services? Oh, what a great question, John. Thank you so much for bringing that up. Okay, so when you have different services, one of the things that I recommend, and I'm assuming in this scenario what we're talking about is that both services are going to have the same theme, which I highly recommend, because that actually is going to keep the church itself solidified in terms of a common spiritual journey, even though people are going to different services. So same theme. So what I would have is have everybody who's working on both services at the brainstorming party. And then you may have a couple of people who are going to research things that are going to be different for contemporary. A lot of times this will be music related, right? They may research, make lists of songs that it's going to be a different repertoire than a couple of other people who are working on those lists of songs for the traditional service. But all those people who are working on it came to the brainstorming party. They know what the main vision is so that their work is most efficient and their choices are more right on so that they really know what's going on. So I always recommend that you start in a common point together, especially as the theme is being set, as the visionary is casting the vision to the whole team. And then on those pieces that need to be different, then you might have some different people working on that, but you're all still part of the same team. Your visuals may be very similar in the two spaces, or they may be very different if you're in two completely different spaces. If you're in the same space with two different sort of styles of worship, then you want to talk about how can this be true for both things. You may use projections in one service and not in the other. And so you're going to have maybe somebody who's searching for images and putting together that palette, that background. And we'll talk more about this when I get to the media arts chapter. They may be working specifically on that service. So I would definitely always think of the worship team being the same team with then people who specialize in some of the tasks that are going to be different for both. It's really going to depend on your services, how different they are, that kind of thing. There's going to be perhaps some ideas that will get brainstormed specifically for one service because you can do more, you can be more sensory rich, it can be more interactive than perhaps another service. All right, Dan says, hey Dan, we are just starting to create our worship team. Yay! Besides the pastor and the music director, who else and how many people might be on the core team? That's a really great question. All right. So if you have volunteers that are going to be working all year long and that's your goal, I would suggest that you have a visual arts coordinator. So that coordinator doesn't mean they do everything. It means that they are going to make sure that each series has some people to work on visual arts, right? So again, when you're asking somebody to be on the core team, it doesn't mean that they're committing to be the person who does all the work, the grunt work, the everything for the entire year. Again, that's kind of a recipe for burnout. So you want somebody who is excited enough about it that can get others excited about it as well and spread the wealth of tasks around. So a visual arts coordinator would be great. If you're using projections, I would have a media coordinator. Again, you want somebody who is excited about that, who has some skills about that, or can learn, because it's easy to learn how to put a background picture in and put words on top of it. We have webinars in the Worship Design Studio about that. There's just lots of ways to train. Have your media coordinator read the media chapter, and they're going to get tons of ideas. It may be that a media coordinator is just somebody who is helping with sound volunteers and turning lights, dimming lights up and dimming them down, even if you have natural light. We'll talk all about that in the media chapter thing. So, visuals and media. Now, If you're a very small church, that visuals and media person might be the same one. It just depends on how many volunteers you can get for a core team. And then I would have somebody who is who can be kind of what I call a dramatic arts person. And in the dramatic arts, in the worship design studio, that doesn't just mean drama and dance or skits or what have you. It's about people who coordinate readers. So verbal and dramatic arts, that could be one person. Somebody who is excited about the words part of the service, as well as things like the ritual actions that I just described, going and lighting candles or water or stacking rocks or whatever that is. But it's somebody who's going to be excited. And you know what? If you have any theater people, these people are perfect for this role. If you have anybody who is in community theater or had a theater background in high school or college, I mean, these people are golden for that role. So, if you can expand it to, say, 5 people, pastor, music director, a visual arts coordinator, a media coordinator, and a verbal/dramatic arts person. That's a super wonderful core team. And again, doesn't mean that all those people do everything. It just means that they have their eye on that, and they are excited enough to get others excited about it. Okay, so Allison says, we've already invited congregation members who are visual artists in any genre or poets, writers to submit works of original art by the end of August. Cool. These articles will be displayed throughout the church. If something really speaks to the worship team, we will ask permission to use it in our services. Ooh, I love that. Our theme for September is Covenant. We will try this for 6 months in hopes of getting congregation members really invested in our services. At the end of each month, the art goes home with the artists, and hopefully other items will be submitted for the next month theme, in this case, prophecy. We'll let you know how well this does or doesn't work out. I love that, and please do, seriously. I'm very serious about you letting me know how that goes, Allison. I think it's a wonderful idea, and it's very close to what Howard Hanger does at his church, and that is that he writes his synopses, and we talked about last month's webinar, we talked about writing synopses. These are descriptions of the overarching theme and then 2 to 3 sentences about each Sunday. He writes those out. He sends them out to the entire congregation. And then he invites anyone to feed back to him things that it makes them think of. Songs, poems, whatever. And people will volunteer and say, hey, I've got this or that or this or that. And that's the way they've just established this kind of rhythm. Now, he puts those out, way ahead of time. So people have time to do that. And then they have time to schedule them in. They're on a quarterly kind of schedule because they follow creation spirituality. And so it's a little bit different than following, say, a liturgical year. But that's very similar to what they're doing. And I love it. And I can't wait to hear back from you about how that goes. There's just so many different ways to get people involved. It does take some forethought, though, right? I mean, we can't just, the week before worship, think, oh, I wish there were more people involved. It really does take planning together and planning ahead. And again, this, I think, is a very faithful thing to do. I had a thought. Oh, my gosh, here we go. We're getting close to the end of the hour. I had a thought and it just went away. That thought was, this is what it was. A lot of churches got into this habit, and maybe you're in this habit as well, of having a monthly liturgist. So this is a person who will do, in a traditional sort of service, the call to worship. They'll do perhaps a prayer. They'll do a scripture reading. Maybe they'll invite the offering. And that's one person per month, and they do that for the month. And so basically what we're seeing is a pastor who preaches, we're seeing a liturgist, and perhaps a music director. And those are the 3 leaders the entire month. I really want us to get out of that paradigm. I want us to consider, if we have a call to worship, and it's leader people, leader people, leader people. You just had leader people, leader people. 3 opportunities to have 3 different voices lift up their voice in one sentence each. If you're a small congregation, this can happen either by calling people ahead of time and saying, I'd love for you to read one sentence in worship, just come 15 minutes early and I'll give you the page, or I put it in the attachment. Or you can, just 5 minutes before the service starts, if you sort of get this rhythm going in your small enough congregation, one of the great things about being a small congregation, you can do stuff like this. You can hand them a script with that one sentence highlighted. And if it's a small enough room, they just read it from where they are. So what I'm trying to get at is that if liturgy is literally the work of the people, we've got to have more people leading us than just 3 people a month. The same 3 people a month, and just having one liturgist switch every month. So that's just really not touching very many people and getting them involved. So I'm really, if you have that liturgist a month kind of thing, see if you can transition into something a little bit different. Maybe that liturgist per month is what I call a series team leader, who is in charge of getting more people involved, the logistics of that, who can help you with that. I talk about that in the second chapter too, the importance of a series team leader that helps with the details. Because pastors, if you continue to be the only one in charge of making sure all the details are put together, then you become more of a manager than a visionary. This is super important. Find those people in your congregation who just love organization. If you have this time-tested and trusted methodical process that Ron Howard talks about, they know exactly what they need to do and can help you do that. I think this is super important. And that person also can be the person on Sunday morning who's making sure those 3 people that you asked to come and read those sentences have actually walked in the door instead of you, right? Because if your attention is focused on that, and then all of a sudden, last minute, so-and-so didn't come, and you have to get somebody else to do it, then what are you doing right before you have to be the spiritual leader of this congregation? You're like this, wah! Right? That's not the energy that the entire congregation needs from you. They need you to be more centered. So finding those organizational people, we call them shapers in my research about energy patterns, but people who love organization. These people can be so important as part of the team. And all they may do is to help you keep track of the tasks. Now in the Worship Design Studio, we have a design app, and there's many features on it, but the 2 features that most teams are using who are members of the Worship Design Studio is the brainstorming feature, which is a way to collect ideas from the whole team during that month, so you don't have to have face-to-face meetings all month. And the other one is the task manager. And so you can assign tasks, and it sends automatic emails to people, and they can automatically tell you that they're done with that task. So this can be a real gift. All right, I see. Let's see. Oh, I didn't scroll down. The app you said was easy to learn. Bob, I was talking about some of the software, the projection software, that can be easy to learn for somebody who is comfortable around computers. John says, I love the idea of sending out stuff to the entire congregation. I will do that. Thanks. Awesome. Congregation perceived that the series team leader was the worship design staff person, as this person asked for leaders to assist with worship. Suggestions. Worship design staff person. Was this a bad thing? Is that you're saying that this was a bad thing? That they perceived that the series team leader was the worship design staff person? Did that cause problems? So I would just say be more clear in your communication with the congregation about what a series team leader is, and that's going to shift around perhaps, between a couple of people. And these are people who are helping you take care of details so that you can focus on making your sermons better. There's an answer for you. Okay, so Glenn says we use Planning Center for worship planning, ProPresenter for projection. That's awesome. Those are 2 wonderful tools. That's great. So let me finish up by saying that if you want to, a good way that's coming up very soon to help train your team members, because anybody, when you sign up your church to do this Reboot Your Worship, anybody from your church can sign up to get the materials to be on our weekly webinars. This starts September 11th. Weekly, for 6 weeks, I send out materials on a Sunday for you to study. It helps train your team. We talk about many of these concepts about the methodical process, the design process, so you can get people on board. So this is a super time if you're just starting a worship team or you want to retrain a team to get on board, and it's going to really dovetail with the things in the book as well as the things in Worship Design Studio. And so we'll be getting ready for Advent, but at the same time, we're training your team in the process. So it's a super way to get a team on board. Registration is going to begin later in August, so just keep an eye out, marciamcfee.com. If you're not on our mailing list, you can go to marciamcfee.com, and there's a little thing where it says, get 6 free articles for giving us your email. Just sign up for that, and then you'll be on our email list to get notified when that registration is ready. And those of you who are Worship Design Studio members, that's free to you. All right, and then also I mentioned last month that we have Worship Design Studio planning retreats coming up. We have one in Kennebunkport, which is sold out in terms of rooms, but we still have some commuter spots for those of you who are close to Kennebunkport. We have one in North Georgia, beautiful Blue Ridge Mountains location. So we have people flying in. There's lots of different airports actually that are within an hour from that, so easy to get in there. And then we also have one in Tahoe where I get to live, and that will be in October. So that's a great way to also get your team on board, or at the very least, come yourself, pastors, and plan your year out. So friends, thank you so much for being with me on this second webinar about the book, Think Like a Filmmaker, Sensory-Rich Worship Design for Unforgettable Messages. You can buy it from Amazon if you haven't already bought one. If you want to get multiple copies for your team, we give a 15% discount if you buy it through our website at marciamcfee.com, or actually thinklikeafilmmaker.com. You can order it there. If you do 3 or more copies, it gives you an automatic 15% off. But I also want to encourage you to check out the price on Amazon. Just fluctuates wildly. We can't really figure out what the equation is, but sometimes it's cheaper. So you might be able to get it even cheaper if you're getting multiple copies there. So always check both places. Anyway, I hope this has been helpful. Again, we're going to be doing these monthly on the first Tuesday of the month, and I'm just going to be going chapter by chapter to sort of introduce you and get you further into that material. So as you read it, you know, one of the reasons I made it a larger format is because it gives you lots of room in the margins for your notes. So as you read it, just jot down questions, notes, comments, and then come on these webinars and share with us, because it makes everybody's experience deeper and richer. I also want to make sure that you remember that every time you see one of these little things in the margins, these little icons that says to see a video about this, or to see the full script, or etc., those are bonus materials. And when you go to Think Like a Filmmaker, you're going to scroll down. There's a little form that you fill out, and you give your name and your email, and what that does is automatically sends you links to our website pages that have a ton of extra bonus materials that goes with the material in the book. So if you've bought the book, you haven't just bought a book, you've bought access to a bunch of bonus materials. So be sure you do that, because it just creates a much fuller experience of the book itself. Okay, friends, that's it. Thank you so much for being on. You will get a reminder in your email if you're part of our email list about next month. And in the meantime, I hope that you'll spend August thinking about how you can get people involved, maybe in September, and get them trained, get them excited, and get them on board. So thanks so much for everybody and for all that you do week in and week out to bring the word alive, to change people's lives in order to change the world. All right, take care. Bye-bye.